It's November 12, 2021. I'm Todd Dunn, and today I'm back in the boat shed to continue the installation of the new cabin sole in the forward cabin on my 1972 Allied Princess Sequester. Over the last few days, I've fit and glued down a layer of 3/8 inch plywood, and that plywood isn't marine plywood because it simply isn't available here on Mount Desert Island right now, and I need to get this job going. So I used exterior grade. I filled all the voids with epoxy putty and painted the edges of the plywood with epoxy to seal it up, and then epoxied it down inside the boat and clamped it while the epoxy cured with screws that went through it into the substrate. And since my last video, I came aboard and I backed out all 117 screws that I used to clamp that plywood down, and I filled the holes with epoxy putty and then sanded the epoxy putty out to make the plywood surface fair. Then I measured the area and figured out just how much wood I would need to build the cabin sole. So yesterday morning I made a run to the lumber yard and acquired the wood that I needed. Now the new cabin sole is going to be a composite made up of 2.5 inch wide strips of cherry with 3/8 inch wide strips of white maple between them. And that'll give us a sort of darker and lighter wood contrast, a lot like a traditional teak and holly cabin sole, except that I'm using cherry and white maple because they are more available and much cheaper than teak and holly. After I got home yesterday from buying the cherry, I had white maple on hand. I ripped the cherry into 2.5 inch widths out of the 1x6s that I bought. So each 1x6 gave me two 2.5 inch by 3/4 inch thick pieces of cherry. And then last night I epoxied a strip of white maple to the first strip of cherry. Right now I can only do one at a time because of a combination of limited availability of heated space for the epoxy to cure in and clamps. Now I have lots of clamps, but most of them are pretty big and aren't really suited to gluing something that's 2 7/8 inches wide together. So anyway, let's take a look at a strip of cherry. So here's a strip of cherry, 2.5 inches wide, with a strip of white maple, 3/8 of an inch wide, edge glued to it. Now this is not 3/4 of an inch thick because this morning I got up and ripped the 3/4 inch thick composite plank that I had in half to produce a piece of new cabin sole that's a little bit under 5/16 of an inch thick. And that is what I'm going to glue down today. So the procedure today is to fit this because it's going into a triangular space, so it's going to have an edge cut off of it, so it'll fit up against the side of the triangle. And once it's fit, I will glue it down with thickened epoxy. So let's get below and get to work. Now, in order to glue one of these pieces of wood down, the first step is to cut it to length, which I've just done. And now I have to fit it into the forward end of the opening where it's going down. Now what I want to do is have the white maple strip centered on the center line. Right up there at the tip of the little triangle, it is 4 1/8 inches wide. So if I center the 3/8 inch wide strip of white maple on the center line, it's going to extend 3/16 of an inch past the center line. And I have laid out a line at that position. So what I need to do now is determine how much of the forward end of this piece of cherry I need to cut off so that it will fit into that angled corner. So I'm going to do that right now. Now, in order to determine the amount of cherry and the angle to cut it off at, what I'm going to do is use this piece of plywood that I cut to the same width as the piece of cherry with the white maple glued on. That's 2 7/8 inches. And I'm going to line that up on my center line, which I don't know if you can see it, but it's there, and push it up until it is parallel to my line, which is actually the right-hand edge of the strip of white maple. And so the corner of the pattern just touches the side of the cabinet work. And then I'll draw a line at the end, and that'll give me a reference for where I have to cut my angle in. Now I know where the corner is on my piece of wood when it's in the right place, and I've got that marked on there, and I'm just going to determine how far back I get to full width. So I'm going to do that. It's a two-hand job, so I have to put the camera down. I've put my pattern in there now and got it in the spot where it's lined up with the reference line, and the corner just touches the side of the cabinet work. And I don't know if you can see it, but I drew a line in there. I just have to measure how far back that line is from the end of the space, and that'll determine where I'm going to cut to, how far back my angle will be on the plank. As you can see, I've cut the angle off the end of the plank, and I've test fitted, and it's just about right. And I used where I cut to, I measured the distance from the end of the plank, which is that end down there, and that's the length I'm going to cut my next plank to, and that is 47.5 inches. So I have a good reference for how long the next one needs to be, and I'll be able to then use the same technique to determine the angle to cut across the next plank. So at this point, I am ready to begin the process of installing this plank. Now I have laid the plank down where I wanted it and marked along the edges, and then taped where the boundaries of the cabinet sole plank will be. Okay, the next step will be to paint this area with unthickened epoxy as well as the back of the plank. And then I'm going to coat this with a thin layer of thickened epoxy, and we will set the plank down. However, before I do that, I'm going to do one other thing. Now, the plank is in place between the two tape lines, and what I've done, you probably can't see it here, is about every foot on each side of the plank, I have driven in a stainless steel brad right against the side of the plank. And it protrudes above the plank, but the purpose of this is not to hold the plank down. It's just to keep it from moving from side to side during gluing, because a plank like this with epoxy on it can sort of slide around, and these brads will hold the plank in position, and once the epoxy kicks, I will remove them. And what I'm going to do to press the plank down is I brought some lead weights to put on top of it. I've got some 2 by 2 inch square lead rods that I'm going to put on top. They're going to be pretty much the full length of this plank, and that'll provide plenty of clamping pressure to hold it into the thickened epoxy. So at this point, I'm going to go mix up some epoxy and glue this plank down. Well, I've now painted the plywood with unthickened epoxy, as well as the back of my plank. few burn marks from when I ripped it apart, which won't matter. And now I'm going to make up some thickened epoxy and coat the plywood with it. I've now got a layer of thickened epoxy along the strip of plywood where the plank is going to go. So the next step is to set the plank in place. I'll press it firmly into the thickened epoxy, and then I'm going to put the lead weights on top of it. Now the plank is down. I applied a heavy weight to press it into the epoxy. In other words, I stepped on it. And just push it down. It's a little springy, so it will probably pop back up without some additional weight to hold it down. So at this point, I'm going to go get my lead weights and put them onto the strip of planking. Well, there she is. She's got about 80 pounds of lead on it. That should hold it down pretty well. And the only thing I have left to do is to pull that tape which hopefully will bring up any squeeze out. And so I won't have to sand it away. So I'll pull the tape and that'll get the squeeze out of there, and hopefully everything will be done. So that is putting down the first piece of my new cherry and white maple cabin sole. I'll come over here Monday and put 2 more pieces down, 1 on each side, because I'll have a fixed point to work against on each side, and continue that until I get all 17 pieces that need to go down installed. Okay, that's that. If you liked it, please give me a thumbs up. If you haven't, please consider subscribing to my channel. And I'll just say again, thanks for watching.